Dave, thank you very much for joining me today on the What is a Good Life podcast. As three discerning friends of mine have sent me articles of yours in the last couple of weeks without knowing that I was interviewing you, I've been very intrigued to see how this conversation goes today.
Cool.
So as we begin, we start with the question, Dave, of is there a question you're exploring as you move through life?
I tend to explore different questions at different times. I mean, the thing I'm really working on at the moment is this concept from theoretical physics of substrate. That's a sort of concept of what's afforded to you by the environment you're in, and really looking at switching the whole of organisational society design from objectives and goals into how do you actually manage a substrate so that good things will happen more naturally and bad things less naturally. And that's a huge theoretical and practical body of work I've been working on now for about 10, 15 years, and it's starting to come to a head.
And out of interest, Dave, how did that question or even that theme emerge for you?
It came out of a variety of things. I think one is, I spent until virtually when I was 50, we're now actually about 45 working in industry, then in IBM in research until I was 50. And I got really fed up of management fads. I really got fed up of leadership. I really got fed up of, this constant cycle of some magical solution to everything. And the reality was, and this is what I found in IBM, what really matters was your informal networks, your connectivity. That's what makes big organizations work. And that substrate, that informal, it's like the fungal roots that connect tree roots in a forest. It's that informal network which sustains organizations despite the consultancy interventions. So I wanted to make something more authentic to that. And then I fell across constructor theory at How the Light Gets In, which, if you don't know, it is an annual festival of philosophy and music at Hay-on-Wye in Wales, which I've been going to for over a decade now. And that came together with Alicia's work on constraints, and then the work I was doing on agency and Latour, and a whole body of, I'm a generalist, all right? I read voraciously, and things start to come together, partly because, to be honest, I'm dyslexic, and that's what dyslexics do. We connect things. So it sort of started to form, and now it's sort of becoming very concrete.
Out of interest, could you give me a sense of the feeling that you were experiencing as you became more and more maybe disheartened with management theories or magical solutions?
Oh, frustration and curiosity, I think. I mean, first of all, I could play the game. I wouldn't have survived if I didn't, all right? I remember employing, when I was a strategy director, one of the big consultancy firms, and told them what kind of result I wanted so that I could say I'd implemented their report. That reduced my personal risk, all right? So, and certainly what I found when IBM acquired the company I was working for is the bureaucracy was probably adding about 20 or 30% to the de facto cost. And that's an opportunity. And I've just been developing this metaphor of an estuary and a delta and a fjord, right? What happens in a delta is sediment accumulates to the point where the river loses its interaction with the sea. So it loses its brackishness, its creativity. And that's what you see in large organizations. It's not anybody's fault in particular. It's the accumulation of sediment and debris over time. So what I'm fascinated by is how do you change that?
And just the idea then, Dave, of the substrate and almost creating the conditions for something to emerge in ways, or how did you kind of start to, I guess, consider the significance of not necessarily controlling each aspect of things, but that kind of a emergent capacity and something that maybe even be out of our control?
I don't think there's a specific moment. I studied physics and philosophy at university, went over to completely philosophy, got heavily involved in liberation theology in the 70s, and that involved indigenous land rights and all sorts of other areas. And I think that sort of seminal work in my early 20s. Yeah, the first time I saw somebody killed was when an Aboriginal activist was shot in front of me by a mine security guard. And we went to the police and they said it's only an abo. And that's one of the formative events in my history because I've just realized how dangerous some of this stuff is, right? So, and it wasn't, and again, I think it's what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. It's it's not that people are deliberately be malicious. They get sucked into a context in which they become malicious. It becomes a natural way of working. So I think, that was a mixture of experience. I then got the freedom to read more, to go back into quasi-academic life. Complexity theory came along. That's huge. But then I didn't like the pure modeling simulation of Santa Fe. So I started what was called anthro-complexity. I added anthropology into complexity, then cognitive neuroscience into complexity. And I think it's just the gradual accumulation of ideas, and there's points where everything sort of comes together. Generally, when you're teaching, to be honest, I don't know why academics don't want to teach. It's one of the most fertile sorts of ideas I ever get. And then other people can pick it up and use it. And one of the things I'm proudest of is most of my frameworks are used without our intervention.
Can there's much you said there, but just out of interest, the sense of things coming together.
Mm-hmm.
Can you describe, even as you were saying at the very start, just how even over the last 15 years, this notion of the substrates coming together? Could you give us a sense of how that's experienced?
Yeah, I think the way it works, to be honest, all right, is you read lots of books, you get asked questions, and then you get thrown into a conversation. I was having a conversation with Japanese partners in Japan, and the discussion got so animated, we missed 3 stations and had to go back again, all right? Cynefin came together when I was teaching at Aston University, and I suddenly drew it for the first time. Now, it's not that that's a moment of genius. It's an accumulation of things over time, which comes together, but in conversation. And if you do theoretical physics, there's a point where the maths looks beautiful. It's the same sort of moment. Hang on a minute, I've been working on this, and now it looks right.
I've read something of yours recently, just on the Celtic sense of wild, of the
Yeah.
wild, and I was really just intrigued by the kind of reverence almost for presence in a system, or attentiveness to a moment. And I was just curious, even in terms of this coming together, or clarity, just how
I
that
think,
interweaves.
yes and no. I'd be very cautious about using the word presence because I think that's been culturally appropriated by people in MIT, all right? The whole theory U from Sharmakas is exactly what presence isn't about. It's not some North Atlantic neo-colonial view of linear progress towards everybody becoming like you, which is what we see in that. No, I think presence is, and I grew up in Wales, all right? I'm Welsh. I've been walking the hills since I was 5. My father was a vet. Yeah, my mother was a teacher and a politician. And that sort of childhood just immerses you in things and you learn to pay attention. You don't survive walking in the mountains if you don't pay attention and you don't think about things. But there are those, and for me, contemplation is not some facilitated process in faux Buddhism, which is a Western disease, but it's on my bike at 30, 40 kilometers on the road when I go into a state, or 10 or 12 hours of walking in the Lake District or in the mountains of Aurori, where you become part of that. And I think that's the thing that Celtic cultures understand, partly because we're tribal, partly because we've got a very different relationship with the land. It's not if you go back into the history, say, of Welsh and Irish and Scottish, the impact with Anglo-Saxons is crazy. So the Anglo-Saxons say we're primitive because we have no primogeniture. Well, primogeniture is about ensuring ownership and acquiescence of land. In Wales and Ireland, okay, it got split between the sons, but then they married the daughters of other people, and then they married, and everything started to come back together again. So I think this concept of ownership of things is a problem. And as you know, Welsh and Irish have no possessive pronouns. You can only say you were with something, not that it's yours.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's sort of cultural inheritance, which is really important.
But I think there's a real beauty to the way you describe that presence. And also, even just, for this project, I've interviewed over 300 people around the question of what is a good life. And the moments that people come into some degree of realization. I remember one lady I interviewed is having chemo in the middle of the night. She's standing in front of a mirror, bald, scrawny, and her stomach puffed out, as she says. And it was at this moment that she felt she could see her own beauty. and she'd been picking on her own appearance all through her life. And I'm fascinated by the fact that so much of our cultivated ideas of presence, whereas it seems to ignore the actual, just the engagement with the day-to-day life.
I think, I mean, there are two events in European history which kind of like are the problem, to be honest. All right. So one is the Reformation, which, for all the corruption in the church, basically privileges the individual over the collective. That's the fundamental principle. Then that gets picked up in the Enlightenment, which assumes that everything is a rational, logical process. And if you just give people the right education, the right information, they'll make the right decision. And both of those get swept up into exploitative capitalism. I mean, they enable it, right? And I think that's one of the problems. We've moved into this world of individualization, of exploitation, of the assumption of a weird form of rationality. And everything we now know from cognitive neuroscience says that consciousness is a distributed function. I've been arguing of late that the individual is just a coalescent pattern, a nexus in a body of interthreaded connections that we don't fully understand yet. And that's not been mystical. I mean, if anybody else talks about quantum coupling as can happen at a macro level, you just know how stupid they are, right? You need to read your physics, but fundamentally, there's more to human communication than we understand. And we know that pheromone traces help determine trust. We know that a mother's heart can restart a baby's heart if they sleep together. We know that dowsing rods work, and we're starting to see that the dowsing rods may trigger a mechanism of human sensory capability we don't fully understand yet. And I think that sensory capability is part of being part of a physical world as well as a mental world. And the separation of the physical from mental is again a sort of Anglo-Saxon, Northern European sort of dualism. Yeah.
From your perspective or experience, how do you tend to balance that, the physical and the mental?
Just do both. I don't think them ever separated, really, to be honest. All right. I mean, yes, if you're stuck in front of a screen, but that's not the case. But that's where the ideas come, is in the outside or in conversation. I think conversation is key. It's actually one of the things, to be honest, that LLMs do quite well, provided you're careful. Because certainly I'm dyslexic, all right? So I can't keep my mind on one thing at any one time. And I can't read a text. I actually skim 2 pages at a time. To read it a line at a time takes 3 different coloured pens. All right? It's huge, all right? But the ability to throw ideas in and move them around and then just see how they come back. I mean, I would never do it for anywhere I wasn't an expert. It's that ability to be stimulated. And you can do that through multiple forms of conversation, through reading, through LLMs, through meeting with people, and through actually having arguments. I mean, the sort of the facile anodization of conversation in which nobody is allowed to dispute with anybody else. And the real danger of psychological safety in the way it's been interpreted is a way of destroying innovation and destroying ideas.
Can you just give me a sense there, Dave, the way in which you think that psychological safety is being poorly interpreted?
Well, what it's done, there's a fundamental confusion. I blogged about this recently in a blog called She Wants to Be Flowers, which is a reference back to the Mabinogion. Sorry, I was in a poetic mood when I did it. But fundamentally, people can't confuse criticism themselves with criticism of what they're saying. And that's become a disease. So, if you go to some events, if you say anything remotely critical of somebody's ideas, it's taken as a personal attack when it isn't. It's a conversation. And I think that's a real problem. So, and it's also, I think there's a lack of rigor or depth when people put an idea forward. It's almost like there's this language of platitudes and quasi-mystical language, which you're not allowed to argue with because it sounds beautiful. And that's a different form of tyranny as far as I'm concerned.
From just out of interest for you, was that always, was that something that you could separate quite clearly, or was that a process yourself?
Brought up to it. I mean, in our family, all right, you would put an idea forward after dinner and everybody would try and tear it apart. When we all knew what we were doing, all right? I didn't tell my wife about that when she joined, and they didn't trust her for a bit. And then one day they decided she was okay, so they went for it, right? But we've recovered from that. But also, I mean, from the age of 11, every week, I was walking to the front of a class and being given a card. I still remember the first one. It said, "You support capital punishment." And I had to argue for something which I think is profoundly evil for 7 minutes without preparation. We did that every week from 11 to 18. And those of us who are good at it were taught rhetoric. So the ability to put forward a case you don't believe in for the purpose of discussion is again something people have lost. It's an unwillingness to explore things intellectually, which is really damaging to modern society.
For you, just with regards to that willingness to explore, like have you surprised yourself just from that perspective? Like, is there a moment that's come to you where you've actually fundamentally changed what you think about something as a consequence of even that initial exploration?
I think there's a few points where you could say there's a phase shift, but you can see the phase shift accumulating. I mean, phase shifts are changes in energy gradients over time. So I think this concept of a Damascus Road conversion is kind of like a false one, right? And I don't really believe any of them, including, by the way, St. Paul's. I'm very dubious about that one. But I think what you see is there's a point where some things come together and you flip. Then you can see something in a different way. I mean, complexity theory did that for me. Constructor theory did that for me. A conversation recently with a bunch of psychologists in Japan really did that. So you can see points where things come together and you start to switch. But then you look back and you can see the accumulation of that over time.
And could you give us the specifics of the encounter with the psychologists in Japan?
Oh, we're working with them. I mean, they're really nice people. So they created the concept of wave shaping, which I picked up and developed. But they did it in the concept of individual psychology. So they're interested in that aspect of it. So, and I've always opposed that concept. I don't buy the concept of inner and outer. I think we really need to realize that Freud and Jung were, gentlemen of their time and had an abusive relationship with their patients, by the way. And we need to move on, right? So we were having this debate about the focus of the individual and the collective and which is the more important. And my argument is the collective is more important. You sit within this nexus or this attractor mechanism. And it was interesting in that conversation, we found a way in which we could see some sort of common ontological position arising out of it. But that couldn't have come by either of us thinking separately. It came by that dialogue. And it was a dialogue which was ferocious, but with respect. And I'd say that's the thing we've lost. We've lost the ability to actually have a reasonable argument with somebody, even though you respect them. I mean, Max Bass and I used to do this all the time. People used to sell tickets. Yeah. And it was thoroughly enjoyable because we got something out of it. And we need that desperately in society. We need the ability to have differences which don't become, effectively Manichaean separation, which is what we see in the States at the moment. If you suppress ordinary day-to-day differences, the differences when they come out become extreme.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that, to be honest. But how do you sense then, Dave, we move towards more of that? I know what you're saying from your past as to how you think we were trained or we were much more attuned to that. But from where you see it now?
Some of it is education. Education has got obsessed with teaching people things rather than creating processes by which people learn. So, for example, if I take the impromptu debating we did every week in school, in the Allen School in Mould, that's a process which made us generalists. You didn't know what you were going to get hit with, so you read everything. You weren't taught to be critical. You learned to be critical by arguing for things you don't believe. So, and in Australia, they taught philosophy to primary school kids. We should do that because that's when primary schools are really interested in, concepts like what is good and what is evil and what's right and what's wrong. So there's that aspect to it, all right? I think the other thing we need to increasingly explore is to change the granularity of interaction. So when I was working in Ireland in the 70s on peace and reconciliation, we didn't try and get everybody together in the big hall and get them all to agree they would be nice to each other. That was wonderfully satirized in episode 1 of series 2 of Derry Girls. And I never thought that really worked. We actually took 2 Catholics and 1 Protestant or vice versa. And we dumped them into the slums of Rio de Janeiro for 3 months on an ecumenical project. And they discovered pretty fast they had more in common than they realized, and they had a conversation about their differences in the context of working together without being facilitated. Now, one of the things we're working on at the moment, and we've proved on 3 continents, is using children as ethnographers into their communities, finding stories in common between people who theoretically dislike each other, and then allocating money algorithmically so that those can work together on that problem. So we change the granularity and we change the interaction. We don't decide what it should be. And again, this is a disagreement with the sort of Boston Brahmin type approach. And I made a strong argument lately. I've contrasted Augustinian theology with Pelagian theology. Sorry, this is an indulgence. But with Augustine, everything is about grace and bishops, and you have to go to an authority to be told, and everything has to be reconciled. Pelagius, who was wrongly condemned as a heretic, is kind of like, we got free will, let's just get on with it and interact with each other. And you can see the same thing if you look at Celtic Christianity. Celtic Christianity was based on monasteries with elected abbots based on competence and local chiefs. At the Synod of Whitby, it got converted into kings and bishops. So changing the granularity, changing the interaction, changing the context, those are things which can make a difference. But again, it's a complexity principle. You have to work obliquely at a level of granularity such that actually disputes go away, rather than trying to tell people how they should behave.
Which, if I look at some of the general sentiments and prevailing culture at the moment, there's lots of telling people how they should behave when not even demonstrating it ourselves.
I had that argument in the States recently. Somebody was complaining about the far right banning books. I pointed out that one of the reasons the far right have got dominance is that they had banned books they didn't agree with, so they can't complain.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that's the problem. There's this sort of innate hypocrisy once you get into these dualisms. And I remember once being told by a bunch of Democrats in the States, you can't say that because you're giving succor to Republicans. And I said, but it's true, isn't it? Well, I say it's true, but you can't say it. And that's just crazy, but that's the sort of society we're getting into, where truth is defined by your clan, not by reality. And your clan is only a collection of individuals anyway, dominated by the inspirational leader. So kind of like all of that, we've gone away from what we evolved to be, which is commutarian, interactive, with the land, with people, working together.
Do you sense, Dave, that is there a deeper trust within you as for what we humans naturally tend to do versus what we've imposed upon and maybe, altered or got in the way of?
Well, it's a mortal sin to give up hope, but as Terry Eagleton, as an old friend, said, hope doesn't require you to be optimistic, right? I don't know. I mean, I think we're past several tipping points in climate change, so we are going to face large-scale deaths, all right, heat deaths and everything else. But, the medieval plague killed off a very significant proportion of people, and by the way, we've got more plagues coming. So human beings are adaptive, and there's underneath, I still think, fundamentally, when people have any type of empathy to people they physically interact with, a lot of the hatred can go away. It's when you distance people from that you have the problem.
And really just intrigued by, you mentioned placing a Catholic and a Protestant in Rio de Janeiro and seeing what they realize about themselves in terms of their shared commonalities. What's that like to bear witness to?
You don't. That's the whole point. We've got to stop this concept that, you, the expert, have to facilitate. That's terribly Augustine. We just set it up. It's interesting. There's a lovely film called The Journey, which is near the truth, all right, about how MI5 stranded Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley in a taxi in the middle of a forest and didn't allow the taxi to start again till they'd found something in common. And remember, they were called the Chuckle Brothers, eventually in Ireland. And, Paisley's widow said McGuinness was the only person who really respected it. And again, that's changing the granularity, changing the interaction.
I'm really intrigued by just that moment you alluded to earlier, just in terms of seeing someone shot, and you said just how much that affected, maybe even just the way the direction of your work or just your life in general. What changed for you in witnessing something like that?
I think I'm young, I'm 20, I'm naive. I go to university in the 70s, and I didn't expect in my 70s to see war in Europe. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think if you look at it, I mean, one of the things I learned fairly fast, and that did it in Northern Australia. Um, and the guy was next to me when he was shot in his head. I mean, I still remember the blood. And then I got heavily involved in indigenous work. If you haven't seen Nightingale about the trauma in Tasmania, and realised that there was genocide, that was within my generation. Remember, indigenous people were classified as flora and fauna until the 1960s in Australia. It was only after that things maybe started to change. But also, I was going backwards and forwards across the wall. I ended up in a Stasi cell for 2 nights naked. I still remember getting picked up by the RUC on the streets of Belfast and asking which of my legs did I want broken first. And then they heard my accent and realised I was a mainland Catholic, not a filthy take, so I got thrown out of the Land Rover. So I think one of the things, and in looking back on it, I was lucky, right, in that I didn't live in a bubble. I realised that life could go badly wrong. And we got a generation which haven't grown up with that and haven't realised just how badly things can go wrong. And I think once you see that, you realise you need to do something about it. You can't just sit passively.
The experience, just obviously, because where I'm from, just the experience there of being picked up by the RUC in that circumstance. Can you give us a sense of what was occurring or what that left you with?
I was just walking down the street. I mean, I was working on peace and reconciliation, but to be quite honest, if the provost had come around that night, I might have joined. I was so angry about it. Right? And I think, that's the context. People don't realise just how difficult it was. I remember once being told I couldn't go out that night because I looked like a Protestant. It would be dangerous. But I've got a really good friend who was on the Protestant side, and we can walk down the Ormore Road, and she can call me a filthy take, and I can call her a potty dog, and nobody shoots us. So, things do improve.
Yeah.
And you look at what Ulster have done in rugby and bringing Donegal into effectively a rugby club, which was originally a staunch haunt of Protestantism. So there is real hope if people just change the way they interact.
But I must say something I admire a lot, though, is not only the intellectual rigor which you're bringing to things, but just some really significant life experience or moments that kind of ground things quite a lot as well.
Yeah, I mean, my daughter is in trouble in our family. She's the first in 7 generations of eldest children not to have been in a police cell for civil disobedience before she was 18. And we have a long family history of this, and we're rebels.
Yeah.
And we're rebels because that's how, and that upbringing was really important. My mother was born above a whorehouse in Cardiff Docks and fought her way out through education and studied in Germany in 1947, which, she had to wear a passport around her neck so she wouldn't get raped by British and American soldiers. Right? And I think, that's that sort of close family, that history, that's part of what you are. It's what Cynefin means as a word. It's the place of your multiple belongings. It's a sense of being entangled in many paths. You only partially understand them. And it's a dynamic word. It's not a static word. It's not nostalgia. If you don't know the word for that in Welsh is hirith, which is the desire to return to a place which probably never existed the way you remember it anyway. You can't translate that as nostalgia. But it's a sense of this dynamic, multi-threaded existence in which you're part of a river, you're part of an estuary, things are flowing.
What does, just out of interest, when you reflect on that, like what does that that lineage of people being rebels or your mother's experience, like what does that, when you mention the word belonging, what does that bring for you?
It's identity. Yeah. Identity is not atomistic. Identity is part of a flow over time.
Just given what you were saying about the willingness or the desire to have ideas challenged, and then pointing to hypocrisies that you see, and obviously taking up challenges in the world where you want to do something about it. Just wondering, how do you navigate that kind of the levels of hypocrisy that you see in the world, or how does that move you?
Oh, I'm partly I get entertained by it, to be honest. I mean, I'm dealing with one guy who claims to be an academic at the moment, who's condemned my entire body of work based on a 19-year-old article which he hasn't read properly. And to be quite honest, you get brutal when you get that sort of nonsense. All right, I mean, it's pure promotion. I mean, his LLM is reading the data badly. But there are other people. I mean, it's interesting that the blog posts I've been doing lately have attracted people I haven't talked with before.
Mm.
And I'm really enjoying that because people are bringing a completely different perspective they're not afraid to challenge. And I'm learning more through the interactions. In fact, I recently wrote something and said, look, this isn't me. This is a co-creation of the people who asked me the questions. So I think the secret is to find the people who are confident enough in what they're saying that they don't mind it being challenged. I think the problem is people aren't confident enough about what they're saying. And you've got this whole... It's really interesting. It's kind of like a sort of faux mysticism, I called it. This desire to create this homogenized, wonderful space in which nobody disagrees with everybody and we have wonderful experiences and we all sit around and nobody disagrees with anybody else. That's called lotus eating, if you've read your Homer.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like inner development goals, all of these sort of things. You just surround yourself with like-minded people and you decide you are right. And that is a really unhealthy place to be.
Yeah, I think when I was reading a piece this morning about going out to the ocean and into the unknown,
Mm.
I think there's something deeply satisfying. What it sparked for me is even the experience of being in conversation with something where they point out something about me that I know to be true, but in the moment that it can destabilize me, or I can almost feel very like it can get a reaction out of me.
Mm.
But there's something really satisfying about being at the edge of the known
Yeah.
and stepping out into that. And
And
it's
I
actually
mean,
a great source of love, I think, really.
it's quite interesting. If we'd adopted the same attitude to exploration they did in the 16th century, we'd have moon bases by now. We just
Yeah.
decided to make it too safe. Now it's quite interesting. If you look at the growth of extreme sports, I mean, somebody throwing themselves off a cliff in Norway with a kite suit is just insane, but people do it. There are people who are, and this is because we're a species, we're diverse, we're neurodiverse, we're physically diverse. The species has people who want to take those risks. All right. And you don't want to suppress that. You don't want to make things too safe. All right. We make things too safe for children. I mean, sorry, I'm getting old now. All right. My parents threw me out on the streets after breakfast and told me I could come back for lunch if I want and I better be back for dinner. And I sort of learned to survive with people I met on the streets. My children had a sanitized upbringing and they only met safe people. So when I was walking in Los Angeles with my son when he was about 12, we went on a father-son trip. And we got into a bad area in Los Angeles. And I know to walk confidently. And he's by my side saying, Dad, are we lost? Dad, should we look at the map? And I'm just saying, shut up. We just need to walk. Right? But that reaction was built walking to school through difficult areas when I was young and dealing with things. And those are things you can't teach people. They have to be experienced. And people are living in, those sort of experiences are rare these days, or people seek them out, as I say, in extreme sports or whatever. Right? And it's become something people do as an indulgence rather than something the species does in order to find new horizons.
Out of interest for you, what is a healthier approach to, some collective harmony would be too strong a word, but also just engaging with what is either uncertain or uncomfortable for us.
I think you need to avoid homogeneity. I mean, my favourite
Yeah.
illustration of this is, I mean, I'm Welsh, I support rugby. My team is Cardiff. We're a very civilised team. We always cheer the other side if they do well. We never bribe referees. We always play by the rules. As a result of which, we're ahead of all the other Welsh sides in the table at the moment. So I'm feeling good about that. And we've just beaten both Llanelli and Ospreys, who are definitely evil people, all right, who can't be trusted, who bribe referees and have foul supporters. But when the English arrive, we're all Welsh.
Yeah.
Right? Now, that's called coherent heterogeneity. It's the ability to be different in one context and the same in another. And we've lost that with a drive for homogenisation. Yeah? And I think that's a problem for organisations. It's a problem for pressure groups. It's a problem for how we treat climate change. Yeah, where climate change is now becoming polarised into people who want to solve all the problems instantly or people who just want to ignore it. when there's lots of things we could do as an interim. Yeah. So people just aren't seeing things through the right lenses, I think, is the point. And that's been an accumulation over the last, really, since the 40s or 50s.
Uh, jibes towards the Ospreys and Scarlets aside.
I'm just ignoring Newport. They haven't been.
Well, it is interesting, even though just on that very briefly, it is also interesting though when you just mention about people coming together, how for years Irish provinces would dominate Welsh provinces, but as a collective, Wales could completely
That's a good example.
upend the form of the
It
individual
is, but
clubs.
we had a history of being Welsh, and we had a history of small clubs.
Yeah.
You had a history of 4 provinces.
Yeah.
So the provinces pre-existed, and also you weren't competing with football. And also you had Leinster, who are a bunch of West Brits who get all their people from 2 private schools. All right, sorry, it's getting on to that. But one of the other points...
As a Leinster supporter, yes.
Yeah. West Brits, you're all within the pale, all right? I mean, everybody I know in Munster supports us when we're playing against you, all right?
Yeah.
Either way, but the point I'm making is, that's quasi joke. Competitive sports at schools teach people how to be competitive in one case, but to cooperative. In rugby, you shake everybody's hands at the end. And the first time I played for the school first 15, which was a grudge match, it was Welsh working class school against English private school. And I was a number 7, and I broke the other fly half's leg. It was, I just hit him with a hard tackle. It was perfectly fair. I told a story like 10 years later, and this guy stood up at the back of the hall and said, "You bastard, I was that fly half." And we go out for dinner on the anniversary thereafter. Right? Now, that's the point. It's the ability to compete and be the same, to actually see that as a separate part of your life. And I think that's what we're losing. We had this sort of period, where people decided all competition was evil. All that does is make capitalists more extreme. And the irony is it produces the opposite of what you want. Right. So I think that's the sort of thing we need to look at. Where are there differences? Where are we the same? In what, context matters, granularity matters. All these things matter, and we've sort of lost them, I think. Yeah.
When you think then, just back to the opening question around, is there a question you're exploring as you move through life? And you mentioned the substrates and the clarity that you're getting at the moment. Can you talk me through even just the evolution of your ideas within that, and kind of what kind of is becoming particularly clear in that process?
I think the concept, I know, I mean, we know that metaphor is really important to human intelligence. I mean, Bateson originally argued this, and it's one of the big contrasts with systems thinking, which tends to go with Ashby and Shannon and very structured forms of information. Whereas the Batesons, and Nora and I are good friends as well, basically say it's about metaphor, it's abstraction. So metaphor allows you to communicate complex ideas in simple ways, and you see things you didn't see. So, for example, looking at a forest and realizing the mushroom roots redistribute resources to immature trees in a drought makes you suddenly click to say, hang on a minute, that's how informal networks work in companies. So if we can generate informal networks at scale, the company is more healthy. And that's the sort of way that you're starting to think. Yeah. So basically, I've now really been developing this concept of the estuary and the channel. A channel has advantages, but it has massive disadvantages because you go between the buoys, you don't have to think. Yeah. The concept of a fjord, which is basically sterile at the bottom because of that opening lip. Or the delta, which accumulates stuff. So metaphor allows you to convey very complex ideas in a simple way. And now I've got the raw science behind it, I can now lay the metaphor over and make it one's authentic to the other. And that considerably aids communication and change, I think. I may not have answered your question, but I've told you how I did it. Yeah.
And for you, when you get this clarity from that process, and you can see, even what you're talking about, the potential effectiveness of a metaphor, where do you see the challenges from where we are right now to adopting something, and from your perspective, that'll clearly be more effective, but also more human and more communal as
I
well.
think the risk, well, things go in phases, all right? I mean, I remember when everybody said systems thinking was too academic in the 90s, and now it dominates. I mean, the
Right.
systems thinkers don't think it does, but it got popularized through business process re-engineering and Peter Senke's learning organization, so that dominates, all right? And that change happened quite quickly. You can see the same thing would happen in complexity science now. Everybody's tacking the complexity word onto what they're doing. It's mostly old wine in new wineskins, to quote the Bible, right? And that results in failure. But things are changing, and the pressure on the planet. I mean, I've been working with NATO now for several years, and I've just come back from the Ukraine, all right, on distributed command and control and civilian resilience in warfare. Now, that was something I thought 20 years ago was important. Now the world is starting to realize it is. So things are changing, right? And some of it's not going to be fun. We're going to face the first mass heat deaths, and that'll be multi-million people on one day sometime soon. We've got the bacterial plague we're expecting sometime soon as well. That's been held back by the Russian-Ukrainian war. Things are thatching out in Siberia. So the level of uncertainty in the world is about to go through a series of potentially existential changes. And we won't be able to carry on thinking the way we are. So my favourite quote from Lincoln, right, is, as the times are anew, so we must think anew, so we must act anew. And it's both. It's what Aristotle calls Sophia and Pronesis. It's not enough to have theoretical wisdom without practical experience. And it's not enough to have practical experience without theoretical knowledge. And those are the two which, if they interchange, will see us through in some form or other.
Is that just again the looking through history and just seeing how like adaptable we are, seeing how much of what we try to avoid ends up being somewhat shaping us in potentially beneficial ways as well?
Well, beneficial and good. I mean, LLMs, for example, they think inductively. Human beings find inductive thinking very difficult. We're abductive. Sometimes down to the logic of hunches. So the good news, and we know that art is critical to that. Art and religion both actually help abductive thinking. It's innate to what we are. The trouble is, it also makes us prone to conspiracy theories. So the thing which sees novel connections to create a microwave oven because a chocolate bar melted in your pocket when you were maintaining the radar machine also makes you susceptible to conspiracy theories. So that ability to see novel connections is a human capability, and we need to develop it further. But it's been reamed out of education. I mean, I remember when I went up to university, my first essay in philosophy came back with, "This is metaphysics, please rewrite it." And I sent it back with, "Metaphysics is philosophy, please mark it." And we carried on like that for 3 years to our mutual entertainment. But you wouldn't survive in a modern university doing that, but you have to write to the marking plan. So certainly in the humanities, the academic disciplines brain ream you into conformity. Right? And I think that, we've got to do something about that. We've got to go back to that adventure to challenge. We did exams at 16 and 18. Between that period, we had loads of time to explore ideas. Whereas my children, every 6 months, it's another module, another tick box. Right? So the tyranny of making things explicit, that's another problem facilitators have. Everything has to be articulated. You have to articulate your feelings. Why? Just to keep the facilitator happy. All right? Everything has to be made explicit. Everything has to be structured. Everything has to be determined. We're living in a society dominated by an engineering metaphor. And it's not that engineering isn't very valuable, but it's not particularly organic.
What gives you you kind of mentioned the significance about the theoretical and the experiential. What gives you such confidence in the fact that things don't need to be made explicit?
Well, it's not confidence, it's just they're not.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, it's just it wasn't even a challenge to it. I'm
Just do
just
some basic empirical observation.
yeah.
It's like when you go into a workshop and somebody says, "I want everybody to admit their greatest failure," and everybody trots out something which proves how bright they were anyway, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't take much experience to realise that this really doesn't work very well, and it encourages people effectively to deceive themselves as well as deceive the facilitator.
I think there's often, I think, a real feared sense of even empty space in those places.
Well, it's
or
not just that. I think part of the problem is facilitation and coaching has inherited far too much from psychotherapy. And the concept is that the coach is the therapist and you need therapy.
yeah,
And also, it's a very particular form of psychotherapy. I said at the International Coaches Federation the other day, it's about time you all abandoned Jung and Freud and moved on to something more modern, which kind of like caused a bit of consternation because most of them are based on that or some variation of it. Yeah, but the concept of psychosis, the assumption that that's the problem, is a real issue. The reality is in most organizations, things go on as normal and people work on things, they don't articulate it, they understand it. I mean, my father was a frustrated carpenter. I mean, I understood carpentry by working with him over years in the garage. Yeah, if I'd articulated it, I'd have lost it. When my house was being rethatched about 20 years ago, all right, and we lived near Avebury, all right, so the tourist buses would turn up. Yeah, they'd then talk with the thatcher about what he was doing. Yeah, and my daughter made money out of selling teas, which I'm still disturbed about. But then I'd have to spend half an hour talking with him about football so he could forget how he'd articulated so he could go back and do it again. Yeah, if it just doesn't work. Yeah, most human actions are human understanding. If you articulate it, you slow down.
yeah.
Articulating is a coaching mechanism.
But I also like the sense of deficit that we apply to humans to just connect, to be in each other's presence or to understand. Like if it's not said or commented on, did it happen at all? Almost.
Yeah, and I think that is a problem. As I say, what we did in Northern Ireland, what I've done elsewhere in the world, is just doing something there. They're going for a walk together is much better than sitting in a room talking about stuff. Yeah, because walks are fundamental to humans. You're going on a journey with somebody that forces you into a different type of relationship. There's something intuitive about the way you do that. So the physicality is important, and we know that the brain is a decision maker of last resort. Your body and your social environment is making most of your decisions for you anyway. So this over focus on one particular part of the nervous system is a real problem.
For you, when you talked earlier just about like the non-linear ways in which things are done, even ideas are created or novelty is encountered, how we bring kind of perhaps less structured sentiments to how many of which ways we either engage or expose ourselves to unknown, or you know I guess kind of encounter more novel relationships.
I think, well, I'll never give an illustration, right? For my 65th birthday, which nobody could understand, I disappeared into Tasmania to go into the Cradle Mountains. My view is, no, I don't want a massive party and get drunk. I want to go into the hills, right? And Cradle Mountain, I hadn't realised just how difficult a bloody scramble it is, all right? I mean, there's these massive bloody boulders. And there's only one way back. So I knew I could get up this bit, but I wasn't looking forward to going back, right? It was kind of like, oh shit, what am I going to do, right? But, you do that. But then coming back, there was a German woman and two children who were cragfest. Now, I was on mountain rescue when I was young. I just went into an automatic pilot mode. I suddenly discovered I'm at the bottom of this cliff, having got them down. Because actually that being with other people, having a responsibility for that, doing something, and my body remembered what to do. Right now, I think we're losing some of that capacity, but I think that's really important. All right, you need to put yourself in positions which aren't too dangerous, but are enough just to get you that little bit on the edge, to get that. It's not an adrenaline surge per se, because you have to stay calm. And the trouble is, people panic now very quickly because they're not used to failure, so they move straight into panic mode rather than into, okay, what am I going to do about this mode?
Just intrigued as to how you might describe your relationship with failure.
Oh, it happens. I mean, I swore blind at myself in the Lake District the other day with you pay bloody attention, you idiot, or you're going to die, all right? And also, I mean, I've got really good colleagues, all right? Very bright people who work with me, and, they tell me I'm wrong, and that's important. Right? I mean, sometimes they're not right, but sometimes they are right, and sometimes we have to adjust. All right. So, what's interesting is people who actually are argumentative are more open to listening to other people than people who try and sanitize argumentation.
There's an interesting development, I think, sometimes in I'm not a proponent of nonviolent communication or something like that, but there's almost an expectation that somebody, in a theoretical sense, could be angry and do anything but express some anger. I find whereas nobody would tell two people who are laughing hysterically
You've
to
got it.
curb their laughter. I don't know. There's some, please.
Yeah, I mean, there's time where I mean, you have to show your passion for something, and if you don't do that, you're not communicating properly. Say the homogenization is really dangerous. It's like clean language. Well, what's wrong with language? Who are you to say what language I can use? I mean, just read Shakespeare. I mean, there's whole catalogues of Shakespeare's insults. All right, they're brilliant. Yeah.
Intrigued, Dave, just through the course of the conversation, a clear sense of exploring the novel, looking to challenge both yourself and others, a clear awareness both from an experience and a theory sense of our connectivity, our capacity to relate, the significance of setting, and the dangers of homogenization and granularity. Some stunning experiences, whether it's seeing somebody shot in front of you or being in the back of an RUC van. So some really like significant moments and a lineage you refer to as well. Really intrigued to ask you, Dave, the question of what is a good life for you?
Physical and social interaction and curiosity. I mean, during COVID, it was a nightmare. I mean, I normally spend 250 days a year in hotels, which means I'm constantly meeting new people and constantly having different conversations. And that, for me, is a good life.
Dave, thank you so much for joining us today on the What is a Good Life podcast. Rarely have I had a conversation with someone where they use so many terms I'm not quite sure I knew, but with the lived experience that you also brought to it and the heart that you brought to it as well, I thoroughly enjoyed that conversation with you today.
No, it was a real pleasure.